Hello all. This will be a discussion of social class and the mechanism by which social class is reproduced. While the classical economists such as David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, Adam Smith, James Stuart Mill have a working conception or have conceptualized the idea of socioeconomic class or social class and inequality. I want to we will be using Karl Marx and Max Weber's, particularly Max Weber's definition of class, as it is the case that students, academicians and students of social class since the early 1900s, really the 1950s, have used Max Weber's definition of socioeconomic class as he defines this in a 2-volume book called Economy and Society. They've used this concept of social class for a long period of time. The U.S. Census Bureau employs Max Weber's definition of social class as well. Let me go back, draw your attention to one study conducted in 1964. Lyndon Johnson's 1964 declares war on poverty. He maintains that with the signing of the Civil Rights Bill, the last obstacle to a truly democratic society is, of course, poverty. He charged Congress with finding out how our public institutions reproduce poverty, reproduce class, and what our social institutions can do to mitigate or at least interrupt the cycle of poverty. The U.S. Congress, in turn, charged James Coleman, an anthropologist. He employed a social scientist who employed anthropological method with finding out what schools, the part that schools play in reproducing class, and what they can do to transform the life chances of students. Coleman had 2 years to conduct the study. It's one of the broadest, most encompassing social scientific studies in the U.S. known to date. It's simply titled Equality of Educational Opportunity. We simply call it the Coleman Report. However, in this report, Coleman, while it's a lengthy report, he interviewed and gave a battery of tests using both quantitative, qualitative measures, interviewed 60,000 teachers, over 600,000 students, over 6,000 schools across the country. And out of this lengthy report that was published in 1966, his one paragraph stood out above all. Coleman maintained that schools can do very little to transform the life chances of children, that the social inequalities which the students experience outside of school are brought into school and thus are just simply perpetuated, reproduced. Of course, that sent teachers into a tailspin, so to speak, because it suggested that they did not matter and schools did not matter. Christopher Jinks, being another academician, who simply couldn't accept Coleman's findings, replicated his study using roughly the similar numbers and similar tests and evaluation. Came to the same conclusion. In fact, Christopher Jinks' conclusion, as published in a little book called Inequality, simply Inequality. I think in 1972, 1973, Jinks maintained that anything short of a redistribution of wealth in society would not transform the life chances of children. Thus, since the 1966 report, teachers, academicians, people involved in education have seen social class as a problem to be worked upon. As you've seen in this class already with the Takaki text, social classes, issue of class reproduction of class, and issues with class, problems with class, particularly as an impediment to a democratic, a more robust democratic society, are obstacles to be worked upon and addressed. And so, if one thing that schools, and of course it's a problem that schools have faced from the beginning. I like to use Karl Marx and Max Weber because it sets up a couple of typical ways. Because Karl Marx sets up a couple of typical ways of thinking about class, and then of course Weber I think captures it all. It captures it all in terms of the mechanism, at least in nucleus, by which class reproduces itself. Now, in the MacLeod text that you're reading, I think in chapter 2, there are he works through various theories of class reproduction. That's important to get through, but ultimately, what MacLeod comes to is what all, well, not all, but the most warranted and justifiable theory of reproduction of class is Max Weber's, and that's something that runs throughout. It's something that MacLeod employs. So I want to try to make that a little more that reading a little more simple or simpler, because I know, particularly when you get to critical theory, Bernstein's theory, it can get a little convoluted. Max Weber maintained one of the things that Karl Marx wanted to understand was how the shift from an agrarian economy, well, not necessarily agrarian economy, but how the shift from a mechanized society or economy, non-mechanized society, a non-mechanized economy to a mechanized economy affected social stratification, class structure, SES, socioeconomic status, if you want to use those. It's somewhat different from socioeconomic class, but whatever. That distinction doesn't matter much here. And Marx argued, to put it simply, that, and of course I'm oversimplifying Marx here, but nevertheless it comes down to a two-class society. There were those individuals who could afford mechanization, and then those individuals who couldn't. Those individuals who couldn't afford mechanization went to work for those who did, and thus there was a two-class society: the proletariat, the workers, and the bourgeoisie, the owners, so to speak. The middle class, well, I wouldn't call them middle class, the owning class, the bourgeoisie. Again, oversimplifying for sure. Max Weber, another German, and thus society was structured according to a two-tiered system that appeared to Max Weber, another German who came after Karl Marx, to be a little bit simplistic. First of all, what owners could pay out to their workers differed, and thus there was and that difference in pay and financial, well, income made a difference in purchasing power, also made a difference in status, and also not all conditions were the same. I mean, my goodness, if you've ever been in a slaughterhouse, nothing wrong with, we need slaughterhouses, I suppose. But compare the work of of someone in a slaughterhouse to teaching, for instance. Society places a different value on those types of work, those different types of work, and the conditions of those types of work, and thus you get a different status. To make to put it in more terms you could probably understand, I always ask students, what does a Supreme Court justice typically make per year? And I think the answer to that is anywhere from $250,000, $275,000. I don't know I'm not talking about the Supreme Court justice. I mean the Chief Justice. I'm talking about just a justice on the Supreme Court. I do think it's about $250,000, roughly thereabouts. I always come back with, fictitiously, of course, that I know some cocaine dealers that make $250,000 in a month's time. I don't know cocaine dealers, but you get the point. We wouldn't put the two in the same social class. While one, the cocaine dealer, possibly has a greater income than a Supreme Court justice. Society values those types of work differently, and thus you get status. Max Weber's come up with a definition. I've put come up with a definition of social class. There are two components to his notion of social class. Weber maintained that class can be defined this way: individuals who share similar financial assets, power, and prestige. And these components, power, financial assets, which refers to something more than simply income, anything that brings wealth to an individual, real estate, stock holdings, diamonds. I mean, anything that brings wealth. A person's financial assets, power, and prestige compose the foundation of a person's objective circumstances. Now, there's more to a person's objective circumstances than just those three things. For instance, however, Weber maintained that financial assets, power, and prestige affect a person's life chances, and all he meant by that was the opportunities one is likely to face over the course of one's life, which include, measured in concrete terms, that is, occupational status, educational attainment, including quantity as well as quality, income level, choice of marital partners, chances of marital happiness, preferred values, lifestyles and taste, happiness, health. Objective circumstances include those things, those life chances, but life chances are also included in those objective circumstances. That is, financial assets, power, and prestige affect a person's opportunities in the world, measured in the ways I just. But all that composes a person's objective circumstances, the stuff of their lives, the external world, so to speak, and those objective circumstances affect how a person perceives the world. That is, it affects a person's subjective response, as Weber suggested. Social class is composed of objective circumstances, subjective response, the physical stuff or external stuff of a person's life, and their worldview. All he means by subjective response is worldview. Remember that worldview has a time component built into it. A worldview includes an understanding of what the world has been like, what it is currently like, and what it will be like. And that, remember, that according to Weber, a person's objective circumstances, the external stuff of one's life, what they experience, affects how they perceive the world. That is, in terms of beliefs, ideas, anticipations, aspirations, expectations. You'll see this in this text. And when those ideals, beliefs, expectations, aspirations, values are acted upon, they tend, according to Weber, as well as many other academicians, they tend to recreate the very external circumstances that created the worldview to begin with. And so thus you get a circle, a mutually reinforcing relationship between objective circumstances and subjective response. You've heard of the cycle of poverty. Well, that cycle is apparent and at work in every social class, not just working class and for poor people, that is materially poor people. It's true in the elite 1%. There are plenty of let me just make this simple. I won't go on and on with this. I just want to be clear about the definition and then the mechanism, because ultimately that mechanism is what you'll have to trace out in the McLeod assignment, for the McLeod assignment. A little more about that in a little while. But one thing, social scientists, particularly sociologists and people who study social class for a living, tend to, well, they don't tend, they draw a line. They argue that there's an imaginary line somewhere in the middle class. And if you see, American society has been divided into 5 social classes. That goes back to W. Lloyd Warner's work in the 1930s. W. Lloyd Warner wanted to understand how the Great Depression affected social stratification in the United States, and he came up with, after much qualitative sociological research, 5 different social classes. You'll see under this module have I forget his name now. It's not just simply not popping in. Gilbert, Dennis Gilbert, as well as others who have updated, I suppose, W. Lloyd Warner's work. But again, using W. Lloyd Warner's work, they have Dennis Gilbert has identified 5 social classes. U.S. Census Bureau is based upon W. Lloyd Warner's work: 5 social classes, 5 quartiles, and so on. But the social scientists draw a line somewhere in the middle class and argue that above this line, individuals tend to have what's called an open world view, a high degree of self-efficacy. I matter. I can get that operates on the belief that I can get my way, or I can affect change in a time of conflict or great conflict. Social conditions, their social conditions and socioeconomic conditions nurture that attitude. Below that line, social scientists argue that below that line, individuals can be characterized as having a closed worldview. A low degree of self-efficacy. I do not matter. I'm reaction. I have situation is such that I can only merely react and adjust the best way I can. A belief that I cannot, in times of conflict, I cannot get my way. That is also nurtured by the social environment or the external world, objective circumstances. Again, as William James put it, the syrup doesn't always come out so evenly on the pancakes. This is true of social class. Human beings don't neatly fit into these little categories, these boxes. It's a completely human construction. We spill over. Our lives spill over these definitions. However, we're talking generalization and tendency. Remember. They also social scientists also argue that the difference, social class has a difference or makes a difference in child rearing practices. People with closed world views tend to have objective circumstances that are authoritarian, particularly in their work life. In turn, that authoritarian nature or that authoritarian sentiment comes across in their parenting style. It's often said that parents from the working class are often have a parent-centered child rearing practices. There's some truth to that, insofar as their struggle is to keep the lights on, the family fed, clean, with clean clothes, roof over their head. Everything is children's concerns are satellite concerns to the parents' primary concerns, which are the basic needs of life. It's not that they don't care about their children; they do. However, and care about their interests. They want to nurture their children's interests. There's no doubt about that. However, circumstances dictate that their primary responsibility is the basic necessities of life. Not to mention the fact that, depending on the nature of their work, they tend to pass along or reinforce ideals, beliefs, and behaviors in the world that, as they see it, are going to allow their children to succeed at least as well as they have. For instance, I was the first in my family to go to college. All my people on my mother's side were mill workers. All my people on my father's side, mill workers or cotton pickers. My father was a truck driver. My father, who died when I was 11, showed up at my school at the beginning of every year, elementary school. And he wanted to, he make a big ado about this, a big deal about it. He had a big bolsterous voice, big loud voice, and he would come in, always friendly, but come in and he would tell the teacher, "I don't care, I don't care how big the spelling words are that he can spell. I don't care how complicated the mathematics problems are that he can solve. The only thing I want to know is he minding you? Is he paying attention, doing what you tell him?" Ultimately, obedience to authority in working class life is put at a premium. The ability to do as you're told, tenacity, hard work, but the ability to be obedient to authority is going to help you maintain a job. It's going to help you maintain some semblance of stability, rightly or wrongly. I'm just saying we tend to pass along those types of behaviors. Whereas the middle class and up, people with open world views, somewhere in the middle class, it has everything to do with the nature of the work that parents do, tend to be child-centered in their child rearing practices. They nurture their children's interests matter, their children's ability to reason, to be self-motivated, self-controlled. The internal compulsions of the self are important in child-centered child rearing practices, and thus because that's the nature of their work. And if you simply take a teacher who is clearly middle class, at least maybe not in pay, but certainly in status and condition, and when the door closes for most of you, you're on your own. It requires that you be self-motivated, creative, articulate, have the ability to break down complex ideas into the simplest components, the ability to articulate complexity in a way that the uninitiated can understand the complexity, the ability to motivate people to do what you want them to do ultimately. So when the door closes, you have a large degree of conceptualization of both ends as well as means in the execution of your work life. It's all about you in a lot of ways, in the sense that you have to use reason. You are in control conceptually as well as in practical terms. People who work in such conditions tend to nurture those types of traits and abilities and skills in their own children. So there's a difference there. I won't go on with much more of this. I think I've put resources up on the website under the McLeod module. What you'll have to do in the McLeod module is account for the reproduction of class in both the cases of the Hallway Hangers and the brothers. And remember, they're different. One of the things that McLeod wanted to understand was, how is it that Freddie Piniella, the little fellow that he had been tutoring in a summer program, at already age 9, 11, something like that, said, when asked about college, his future, he says, "I'm not going to college. I'll just end up getting a shitty job anyway." How is it that an 11-year-old, McLeod thought, already forecloses on a more middle-class type of life? Well, he comes to see that the Hallway Hangers, a group of mostly white kids, have already foreclosed, have a closed worldview. Whereas the brothers, a mostly all black or African American group, whose condition is roughly the same, is pretty much the same as the hallway hangers. They both live in a project called Clarendon Heights. They have an open worldview. So what you have to do is account for the mechanism by which those worldviews come about. And McLeod does a good job at laying out. I mean, this is you're reading not only an educational classic, but a sociological and ethnographic classic as well. He does a wonderful job at identifying the objective circumstances of these kids' situation, of these kids, and working through how those objective circumstances come to inform their worldviews. So what you want to do is pay attention to the physical surroundings in which they live. I mean, as the hallway hangers put it in that chapter, in one of those chapters, Clarendon Heights has a reputation. I mean, people find out they're from Clarendon Heights, boom, you know the effect. A stigma attached to it right away, and them. So you want to account for the physical surroundings in its effects on their worldview. You want to account for meritocracy. Remember, meritocracy is the standard by which it is the prevailing standard of judgment in many ways that pervades almost all of our social institutions, certainly schools. Their experience, their family experience, their family members' influence and experience on their worldview. You want to account for their work experience and its implications or effect on the worldview. Their school experience and its effects on their worldview. So how do these boys' objective circumstances affect their worldview? And why are they different? Why is it that the brothers who live in the same project, come from the same project as the hallway hangers, and furthermore, they're African American and have to deal with the issue of race? How do they have an open worldview? So you have to account for those things. If you need me, make sure that if you have any questions, please, by all means, contact me. I'll discuss matters with you. Thank you for your time.